Jacob Rees-Mogg, welcome to Acting Prime Minister, and thanks for having us in your office here in Parliament with your staff beavering away here. I gather it's been quite a busy week.
Well, one or two things going on, but thank you very much for inviting me.
I've worn my double-breasted jacket in your honour as well.
Good.
My mum does actually say this is my Jacob Rees-Mogg outfit, so you've set a style trend.
What a bad style trend. I'm sorry about that.
I hope it's not a bad style trend. I've joined it. It's interesting being in your office too. It looks a bit like you'd expect Jacob Rees-Mogg's office to look. You've got portraits on the walls. Perhaps you can tell us who they're of?
Yes, certainly. I've got a portrait of Thomas Wentworth, the first Earl of Strafford, who was beheaded in 1641 for supporting the King against Parliament, and he was possibly the one advisor who could have made a success of the Civil War from the King's point of view. I've then got a portrait of Robert Peel, who founded the modern Conservative Party but split the party over the Corn Laws, and then I've got a succession of political cartoons that I had at home actually and brought in to put on the walls here, and a map of a village in northeast Somerset and land holdings there, which I was given by a constituent because it named an 18th century Mogg on it, to whom I'm connected, but sadly we don't still own the land.
And quite apt portraits in a way, considering the times we find ourselves in now. There's sort of some parallels there. Robert Peel, you mentioned the split of the Conservative Party, the battle between executive, if you can call the sovereign that, and Parliament. There are some parallels there. Oh,
you're absolutely right. The strain between the House of Commons and the executive is at a very high point. Not, I'm glad to say, it high point it reached in the Civil War, but what has been going on recently and with all the Letwin affair has been a breakdown in the relationship between the government and the House of Commons, and the House of Commons trying to do the government's job, which then ended in a ridiculous situation where the House of Commons voted against absolutely everything.
Well, look, for this afternoon we're going to promote you from the House of Commons into Downing Street. That's the aim of this podcast.
Well, to take over as the cat. You hope I'm going to be good at catching mice.
Well, your name is Mogg.
Oh, very good, very good.
No, to be Prime Minister, of course. And there is a vacancy at the moment.
Ah, yes.
And I know you've been asked this already, but just to double check, would you want to stand as Prime Minister at this junction?
I won't be throwing my hat into the ring, no.
Would you ever want to be Prime Minister?
Well, one has to deal with circumstances as they are, and the circumstance as it is that I will not be standing in the vacancy that has apparently arisen. It hasn't yet definitely arisen, because the Prime Minister's view yesterday was a conditional one, that she would stand down if her deal went through, and we don't yet know whether it will go through or not.
But perhaps in the future you might consider standing as Prime Minister. It's not something you've ruled out.
Well, it doesn't arise. I'm a backbench MP, and I will look at the great list of candidates that we're going to get from the many able people in the Tory party whose names will come forward once the competition gets underway.
This isn't a news programme. We're not trying to sort
Indeed.
of pressure you into giving us concrete answers, but there are candidates out there already, we assume. Is there a candidate at the moment that you feel you're likely to back?
I think the party's lucky. There are a lot of very able people who would make excellent Prime Ministers. I have a very high opinion of Boris Johnson, who I supported in the last leadership campaign and was sorry that he decided to pull out. But the competition hasn't yet started, so I think it's sensible to wait until it does.
Do you think it's right that the next Prime Minister should be a Brexiteer?
Well, I thought the last Prime Minister ought to be a Brexiteer. In some ways, the advantage of a Brexiteer is that compromises always have to be made. But if they're made by somebody who is known to believe in Brexit, that is easier to carry the nation along than if the Prime Minister is known to be a Remainer.
And do you think it would be more advisable to have a long leadership contest or a shorter leadership contest? I mean, some have said, why not encourage better diversity of candidates, bring some of the younger talent through by having a longer contest?
Well, I think once the Prime Minister has said that she is going to go and has set a date for it, that sets the timetable for the contest. The contest needs to start in May, from what she has said, and then will take about 6 weeks. So that the new Prime Minister will have the summer to get into office, settle down, and be ready for the Tory Party conference and the session that flows in October.
Okay, well, we've got the newsy stuff out of the way. Let's actually have some fun now and talk about you as Prime Minister in this fantasy world that we're creating for the next half an hour. So I want you to imagine that you walk through that Downing Street door. that you've just become Prime Minister. If you could do anything at that point, what do you think the first thing is that you might do as Prime Minister?
Okay. Well, if it were today, the first thing to do would be to leave the European Union. And we ought to be leaving at 11 o'clock on Friday, the 29th of March. That date's now been pushed back. But I think the first thing to do, if a new Prime Minister came in today, would be to ensure that we left. And once that happens, you open up a whole set of new horizons about how the country can be governed. You're free from the yoke of Brussels straight away, and we could do things that would help people put more money in their pockets. We could cut tariffs on food, clothing and footwear, and we could reduce VAT on domestic fuel. We could make those decisions that help people in their daily lives and particularly help the least well off in society. So that's a very big benefit of leaving, which in my view should be implemented quickly. But the difficulty with Brexit is it slightly swamped all other aspects of domestic policy.
Yeah.
And these need tackling too. I think one of the biggest challenges facing the Conservative Party that any Prime Minister would want to deal with is housing, that we don't build enough houses, and housing has become unaffordable for many people. I speak in universities quite often as invited, and I almost invariably ask who here wants to own his or her own home by the age of 35, at which point most hands go up, the overwhelming majority. I then ask who thinks he will or she will own their own house by that age, at which point many fewer hands go up. And we need to be helping people achieve their natural lifetime ambition of being homeowners. So that's a big challenge. We then need to look at issues relating to taxation, because we have an immeasurably complex tax system that is causing disincentives to earn and to invest in the economy. And it's got successively more complicated, and we're taking more tax as a percentage of GDP out of the economy than we have since the early 1970s, and that's on a rising trend. That needs to be reversed.
I mean, you've spoken partly jokingly before about abolishing income tax. Do you think you would seriously like to do something like that?
No. Abolishing income tax isn't a realistic prospect. The only thing I've said is that when income tax was reintroduced by Gladstone, he said it was going to be temporary and would go. And that is, whatever it is, 150, 160 years ago, so temporary can be quite a long time in political life.
Absolutely. Are there other taxes maybe that you'd like to abolish? Stamp duty, for example, if you want to get people on the housing ladder, maybe that would be a way to...
Absolutely. And one of the things you also need to be doing is to show that the United Kingdom, and particularly London, is open for business as we leave the European Union. And that means making it easier for foreign capital to come in, and making London an attractive place for people who are bringing capital in to locate to, and very high levels of stamp duty are a disincentive to that. So yes, I would like to see stamp duty significantly reduced. Also, you may remember George Osborne proposed raising inheritance tax to £1 million. I think doing something with inheritance tax is important because it hits at a penal rate onto estates in the south of England where people have done nothing other than buy their own home. And that doesn't seem to me to be fair.
Well, you've got to be living in a pretty nice home, or at least in a very desirable area, to be in a home worth £1 million. That sounds like a policy that might help someone of your ilk, but not necessarily someone who is struggling to get on the housing ladder.
Yeah, but it isn't £1 million, is it? That it's £300,000
currently. You're absolutely
That's right. So in the southeast and in London, you're hitting people who are simply living in a house that they've owned for a long time and haven't built up huge reserves of capital.
Okay, so the phone's ringing off the hook because the new Prime Minister's just walked through the door and everybody wants to congratulate you, and there are world leaders jamming the switchboards.
Well, there's one thing I can say on that, and that is the switchboard at Downing Street is quite remarkably efficient and helpful. I have occasional interaction with them, and they are the most wonderful, helpful, politest people to deal with.
All right, we don't wish to slander the switchboard.
No, so they won't be overburdened. They will cope.
There's huge demand, at least, to speak to the new Prime Minister. Which world leader do you think you'd like to speak to first?
The most important relationship that the United Kingdom has is with the United States. The first person any sensible Prime Minister would want to speak to would be Donald Trump. And it doesn't matter who the President of the United States is, that person has a mandate from the American people. It's not for us to determine, and therefore that is the key call.
And would you expedite his state visit, do you think?
I think treating our allies well and laying out the red carpet for them is a sensible thing to do, yes.
You've got to make a speech as new Prime Minister to try and invoke some of your values, your principles. What do you think your political mantra would be as Prime Minister?
The starting point, I think, for conservatism is that the aim of the Conservative politician is to allow people to lead the lives they want to lead and to remove obstacles from their path, rather than taking the view of the socialist who thinks that the politician should set out the path that people ought to follow and direct them in certain ways. So my principle for conservatism is based on the individual deciding for his or her own family the best way to proceed rather than top-down state direction. I fundamentally don't believe that the man in Whitehall knows best, to quote a former Labour cabinet minister.
You've got to appoint your cabinet too. You can have anyone from history, dead or alive. It's a fancy cabinet. Who would you love to put in the cabinet? Oh,
that's a fascinating challenge. Who would you pick from our distinguished history to put into the key posts? Well, I think as Home Secretary you would have Sir Robert Peel, the founder of the police force, in that role.
Good point, yeah. Founded the Metropolitan Police.
Indeed he did. A reforming Home Secretary who made the penal system in the UK much more sensible and balanced, got rid of any number of the capital offences that existed and converted them into ordinary prison sentences. So I think the Home Secretaryship fills itself.
Mm-hmm. You don't have to appoint a whole cabinet. I'm
just going to do the key points.
Don't feel under too much pressure.
I'm going to
you go for it. You select whoever you like.
From Foreign Secretary, this is really difficult. I think the three candidates would be Canning, Palmerston and Salisbury, all great 19th century figures. And I would probably, as we're leaving the European Union and we need a bold and forward foreign policy, pick Palmerston.
Right, okay.
And then for Chancellor, I'd bring back Nigel Lawson, and it has
really?
great advantage that he's still around. I think Nigel Lawson, Lord Lawson, was the most reforming post-war Chancellor who had great success.
Liberated the city, of course.
Liberated the city.
Regulation from banking, which he was largely credited with creating the boom in the city. You know, some people might debate that, but...
And cut taxation in a way that grew the economy and therefore led to higher tax revenues for the state so that it could afford more public services. So he managed to get that golden scenario working. And the other post that is worth appointing is the party chairmanship post, which for any Conservative is always the key spokesman for the party and makes sure the voluntary side works and basically the party can win elections to implement its brilliant policies. And there, I think you would choose between Norman Tebbit and Cecil Parkinson.
Interesting.
And probably go for Norman Tebbit because, again, as he's still alive, you could put him in post quickly.
You could tell him to get on his bike and
absolutely, that's right, that's right.
And get out there and start recruiting new members to the party. Do you think it would be important to have a balance in the cabinet of Remainers and Brexiteers? That's something the Prime Minister's been at pains to do. But
I strongly believe that the Conservative Party is a broad church and that it only works if it tolerates the views of people from different wings. And whether it's as it is now, Leave and Remain, or as it was in the 1980s, wets and dries, if the Tory party becomes a narrow sectional party, it will not win elections. You know my views on the European issue, and I hold them very strongly, and I believe the issue is an important one, crucial one for our country's future. But there are many able people in the party who don't share that view. I happen to think Dominic Grieve is a highly intelligent and capable person. I think very highly of Justine Greening as well. They take exactly the opposite view from the one I take, but they are important members of the Conservative Party. Do
you worry about the Conservative Party splitting? There's a lot of talk of splits. I mean, Steve Baker was very angry this week about the Prime Minister's speech, for example. You would have heard his comments yesterday at the meeting of the ERG. Do you worry that we might be on the brink of a split in the party? Well,
people always worry that the Tory party is about to split, and it doesn't split as often as it is expected to. I think the European issue has been particularly divisive. But once we've actually left the European Union, I think there'll be an opportunity for us to come back together. So, yes, it's difficult. Yes, it is close to a split, but I don't think a split is inevitable. I think it can be avoided with good leadership.
Let's talk a bit about your personality now as Prime Minister. And I think what I find fascinating about you is that in this day and age, a lot of people are sort of apologetic for any privilege that they might have had when they were growing up. People almost fall over themselves to prove that they're working class or that they had a hardship. And I think in this country we can sort of be fairly apologetic for any help that we've had along the way. You don't seem apologetic though, which is fascinating. You seem quite comfortable with your privilege and with people knowing about it.
I'm enormously lucky. You know, lucky in the family that I was born into. That's the biggest stroke of luck, and with a stable family background, a loving family background, which is probably much the greatest advantage beyond material advantage. So I've been lucky to have material advantage as well. And I think as a politician you want to help people have as much luck and good fortune as one has had oneself, rather than saying, well, I've got this, but it's not for anybody else. You've got to pretend I haven't got it, to be dour and gloomy about things. And I think one should be upbeat and say, look, why can't we have every school in the country that teaches people as well as Eton? And we know it's not to do with money. It's to do with the approach to education. We have some of the best schools in the world, not just in Europe. And we should be proud of that, and we should encourage other schools, which Michael Gove did so successfully, to follow in those footsteps.
Do you think people misunderstand conservatism then? Because a lot of people would say, Jacob Rees-Mogg, he's a Tory, so he doesn't care about poor people. Jeremy Corbyn cares about poor people because he wants to spend more money on schools, or he wants to have a better distribution of wealth within the country. And they might think Jacob Rees-Mogg doesn't necessarily believe in that.
I think that is something that the Labour Party is better at getting its message across, and always has been. See, what I think is that people who are less well off should have the opportunity to become better off, and I think that happens if the state allows them to do it and doesn't get in their way. The state doesn't have any money of its own. It only has money that it takes from you and gives to somebody else. And there aren't enough very rich people just to take all the money from them. What you're doing most of the time is taking money from people who are similarly off and giving it to people who are not much worse off, but yet taking it out of the system so that the whole economy grows more slowly. Whereas what I want to do is to create an opportunity where everybody can be better off, and you can raise the whole standard of living for the whole country. And this is why I bang on and on about the ability when leaving Europe of cutting tariffs on food, clothing and footwear, because we have this crazy system where we put tariffs on and non-tariff barriers to benefit producers primarily not in the UK, in continental Europe, so that they make money at the cost of the least well off in our society. So when you lower taxes, you take barriers away, you lift all the ships, and that's what as a Conservative I want to do.
Although some people worry that you make the state smaller, and therefore those who genuinely can't work, maybe they have a disability or they've fallen on hard times, those people who are genuinely vulnerable might have less resource available to them to be spent.
But one of the really wonderful things that David Cameron was instrumental in making happen, along with Ian Duncan Smith, was looking at disability in a different way, and rather than saying what people couldn't do, saying what they could do. And I think it's the case that there are 1 million more disabled people in work now than were in 2010, and that's good for people, that's helpful for them, it improves their standard of living, they make a contribution to the economy. Yes, of course you have to have a safety net for those who can't look after themselves, and that should be generous. But that will be more generous the more successful the economy is, and the more people who are able to succeed for themselves without the state.
I want to ask you a bit more about your personal views, because you're very polite, you're very charming, but some people find some of your views on social policies quite frightening in a way. You're very open about the fact you hold very traditional views, you're a practicing Catholic. Just to remind people some of the things that you believe in, just remind us where you stand on abortion, for example.
The key thing about abortion is, when do you think life starts? At what point is it a new life? And that is defined by the teaching of the Catholic Church at the point of conception. And it's very hard to think of any later point when it changes. That is the fundamental point at which life is created. And in Catholic teaching, a soul is created. And that life has rights from the moment it is created. It is created by God. It is not a responsibility of that point of mankind to take it away. And therefore, life begins at conception, and say the child in the womb deserves protection.
That does raise so many difficult questions, though, as I'm sure you've rehearsed before. For example, in cases of rape, you even believe that abortion is not the right thing to do if a woman's been raped and she would like to not carry the pregnancy.
I accept that this is a very difficult question. I accept that for a woman who has been raped, it is a much more difficult question than if it's been a consensual relationship. But 180,000 babies are aborted every year, of which a handful are the result of rape. So the argument to say that because there may be a very small number of conceptions because of rape, abortion should be legal and is right, I think is a false argument. It is taking a very extreme case, a rare case, and then applying it as a general rule. It's very interesting. The population of Northern Ireland is 100,000 more than it would be if the abortion law in GB had applied in Northern Ireland.
The birth rate is higher.
The live births that would have been eligible for abortion. That's 100,000 people like you and like me who are leading lives in Northern Ireland who, if they'd had the laws that apply in Great Britain, would not be. That's quite a thought.
Same-sex marriage, again, something that you voted against.
Yes, I don't want to interfere in how people lead their private lives. That is a matter for them, and it's not for me, to quote the Holy Father, to judge how people lead their lives. It's for them to decide. But marriage is a sacrament, and the sacraments are defined by the Church. This is very much the same argument as Thomas More made about the marriage of Anne Boleyn to Henry VIII, that he was already married and he could not reinvent the sacraments. Sacraments cannot be legislated for because they belong to a higher authority.
So in this fantasy world where you can do anything as Prime Minister, would you want to repeal some of these laws?
No, that's a very good question. The Prime Minister is not in that position, that it would require Parliament to agree.
True.
And I think it is right that these matters remain a free vote. I think it would be wrong of me to seek to impose the teaching of the Catholic Church on people who are not Catholic, but it would be equally wrong of me to pretend that the teaching of the Catholic Church does not exist and that I do not believe it. I feel I should be honest with voters about what I believe, but I also have to recognise that not only is this not a theocracy, but I wouldn't want it to be a theocracy.
It's interesting because politicians often get asked about their religious views. What does he make of Tim Farron, for example, not being able to answer the question of whether he thought gay sex was it? Do you think he should be able to answer that question as a politician, as a party leader as he was then?
I have a great deal of sympathy for the position Tim Farron found himself in. Because oddly, the Liberal Democrat Party is not very liberal. That you have to subscribe to set politically correct views, and it's very difficult to be a believing Christian within the Liberal Democrats. And it's interesting, David Alton, Lord Alton, had to leave the Lib Dems as a practicing Catholic some years ago because of the Lib Dems' views on abortion, and Tim Farron found that his religious belief was incompatible with being a party leader. I think that's very sad, and I think it shows an intolerance of those who promote tolerance. They don't actually really mean it. They're only tolerant as long as you subscribe to their view.
What about something like capital punishment? Would you want to bring that back?
No. What I said about the unborn child applies to the criminal as well, that these are valued lives, that it is not the right of mankind to take away life. So I'm opposed to capital punishment as well as I'm opposed to abortion.
Gender reassignment surgery?
Gender reassignment surgery can depend on the circumstances, that there are some people who are born without it being clear precisely whether they are,
True, biologically
men or women.
Ambiguous. What about someone believing that they've been born into
I think this is a very complex area, and it's not one that is easily subject to general rules, and you have to look at the individual circumstances. It's not in a way a matter for legislation, because it's a matter for individuals who inevitably have control over what is done to them and what is done to their bodies. It's not for me to tell people that they should not have any particular form of operation. That is an individual decision.
You seem to sort of defend the freedoms and the rights of an individual. You don't seem to want to impose your religious views on others necessarily. You seem fairly happy to hold them privately and perhaps with those around you and your family, but not to impose them on the country as a whole.
I don't think you can impose them on the country as a whole. That people will believe in their hearts what they want to believe. Both the Catholic and the Protestant churches tried in the 16th and 17th century forcible conversions of people. It didn't actually work, and it was very brutal, and in truth it was sinful. Forcible conversion of people is not a sensible way to go. People need to come to faith through the grace of God, not because they've been bullied into it.
There are these interfaces, though, between the state and religion. They do come up, as a Prime Minister, they would come up for you. For example, this week there's been a vote in Parliament on relationships and sex education in schools. I know you abstained on that one. Why did you feel you needed to abstain on that issue?
Well, because fundamentally I think relationship education is the job of parents, not of the state.
And there's been a lot in the news as well about LGBT elements of that education. Do you think it's right for parents to protest outside schools because they are upset with their children learning about LGBT relationships?
Well, in my view, it is up to parents to tell their children about these things and not for schools. I'm not a great one for waving banners about outside premises, but I certainly believe in freedom of speech. I have no objection to the people who chat to me as I go in and out of the Houses of Parliament, who may or may not agree with my views on Brexit, that is part of freedom of speech. And if you believe in freedom of speech, you have to accept people protesting for things that you disagree with as well as for those that you agree with.
It's part of your daily routine now anyway, that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Running that gauntlet.
But you know, people are mostly very polite, including the ones who disagree with me most.
In terms of talking about social media and disagreements, there has been some controversy lately about the comments made in Facebook groups that were in your name, some Islamophobic comments that were made. Why do you think people with those kind of views would be attracted to a group that is linked to you, not set up by you, but has your name on it?
Well, it's not linked to me at all. It's nothing to do with me, and I can't stop people putting my name on things on Facebook. I actually discovered it's worse than that people can send you a message saying, do you want to be in this group? And if you don't reply, if you don't even notice it, your name gets listed as one of their people.
Right.
So that the appearance of things in Facebook can very easily not be the reality. I've made it very clear that people like that not only have no link to me, but I think it's right they're removed from the Conservative Party. I believe in religious toleration without in any way then thinking that the teaching of the Catholic Church is not the truth with a capital T.
But why do you think people who hold those views are attracted to you?
Well, I think you find that they are attracted to all sorts of people. It's not just that they're attracted to me. Some of them, I think, are probably troublemakers, and they enjoy stirring things up a bit and causing a bit of a row, and therefore they associate with politicians thinking that they can do that. And others just have very unpleasant views, but I'm not the only politician who's found that people have put their name in groups and have said that they support so-and-so, but I have no truck with any of that.
Do you read the comments that you get on social media? Because you're quite into Twitter now.
I quite enjoy Twitter. No, there are too many for me possibly to read them all. I do have a look and see how many people have commented, but I think something I put out last week had 6,000 or 7,000 comments. Well, I do nothing but read comments. I don't sometimes glance at them. I tend to look more at the ones on Instagram.
It's a bit friendly,
because they're
Instagram?
charming. They're absolutely charming. People are so nice on Instagram, and I periodically even reply to them.
But on Twitter, I think we were talking earlier, you think it's healthier just not to read these things?
You can't possibly keep up with it, and it's better not to.
All right, we're almost out of time. So as Prime Minister, you've just got to make some snap decisions before we go. Firstly, would you be willing to press the nuclear button?
Oh, if the country was about to go to nuclear war, unquestionably, yes.
Okay, that's a simple one. Would you scrap the benefits freeze?
I think the benefits squeeze has reached the end of its life.
Okay, that's interesting. What song would you dance to at party conference if you had to do a Theresa May and come out dancing?
I wouldn't.
Not
I can't
all.
dance. No, I've never been able to dance, and therefore no dancing. I think it would have to be, the song that would have to be played is Señorita Nina from Argentina, who you may remember married a one-legged man from Venezuela because he couldn't dance. and my sympathies have always been with Señorita Nina.
Excellent. What would your Downing Street pet be?
Oh, good heavens, that's a really good question. Well, I have a 10-year-old daughter who is completely obsessed about getting a dog.
Right.
And therefore, if there needed to be a Downing Street pet, I would have to give in to Mary, and then she would at last be able to get her dog, which I'm quite keen to do anyway, because I believe in giving in to my daughter. So I think it would be probably a Dalmatian. That's what she wants at the moment.
Larry might have to sling his hook.
Tough.
And lastly, where would you go on your holidays? Because quite often people are fascinated to see the Prime Minister relaxing on holiday.
Well, as long as you make sure my wife doesn't watch this, what I really like to do is to go down to Somerset. I don't want to go anywhere else. I like being at home.
Somerset's exotic enough for you.
Oh, I just love being at home in Somerset when you're relaxed and you're not running around like whatever it is that runs around. And so being at home in Somerset for a couple of weeks when one isn't on duty is absolutely perfect. And other people can travel to far-flung parts. You know, I'm afraid to say I think the best thing of going on holiday is arriving back in Heathrow and thinking,
really?
goodness, I'm home. Yes.
You don't enjoy travel then, really?
Well, I quite like the travel, but I'm always absolutely delighted to get back. Even when you go to immigration and they sort of grunt at you, they're never very polite, but nonetheless, you're back home.
Fantastic. All right, well, Jacob Rees-Mogg, you've been a fascinating acting Prime Minister. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you.
You've got a busy week, so I'm going to let you go.
You're very kind. Thank
Thanks
you very
much.
much.
Cheers.
Thank you.